Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for having me. This has been already a fascinating series of talks, and so I'm glad to participate. I want to talk today about using Earth economy models to assess global sustainability policy with a recursive dynamic approach. Is there any way I could get the slides also on the screen down there? Thanks. And this is going to be based on a paper that we have recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled Investing in Nature Can Improve Equity and Economic Returns. So let's get started. First off, I do want to start with an overview. I think understanding the position of economics with respect to sustainability and these challenges that we're facing is critical and also pretty nuanced. After discussing that, I want to jump into the introduction of a new model that we've created called GTAP-Invest. And then I want to actually talk about 4 of the methodological advances that we needed to figure out to make this happen. I guess partially addressing why hasn't it happened before, too. I'll talk about results from the paper shortly after there. And then I want to end on broader conclusions on Earth economy modeling. And you might notice that question mark. That was not supposed to be there. That was my mistake. But I actually like it. It's sort of suggestive of what are these next steps? We have an open playing field here. How can we invest in the right new research at this really critical time? So as Steve and others have said, we are going from the Anthropocene, or the Holocene, into the Anthropocene. And in other words, we're leaving this nice little area, I've circled it here, that's the Holocene. This is temperature over the last 100,000 years. And you can see, might be hard to read, but the second to rightmost line is the beginning of agriculture. All of that has happened in this one narrow little band where there is almost no variation in the temperature. And so that Holocene was very good for us. But we're changing. And you know something is official when The Economist says it. Here we are going into the Anthropocene, where now humans are the driving force of many of the geologic processes that we care about and affect our well-being. I like to think of it in this sort of systems dynamic approach. This is from Stefan et al. But basically, we have different tipping points, and we have different stable positions within this space. You can see the progression of time here. That's a Holocene at the beginning, so that's that stable area that I showed in the line graph. And as we progressed forward, I guess, towards the viewer, we see that we're coming upon a planetary threshold, or planetary boundaries. And that's the dotted line there that is sort of the barrier right before it falls off into some sort of hothouse Earth or some stable equilibrium that is in a place that we really don't want to go. So our question here in front of us, how do we turn the ship? How do we steer so we don't crash through those planetary boundaries and get to what here they've just called some sort of stabilized Earth equilibrium? And so this one's personal. Economics, I wanted to tout our achievements. Economics has been wildly successful at what it is good at. And maybe I take this one personally because I often find myself talking to ecologists who really don't like economists. And so maybe I'm just overstating this response here. But we did phenomenally well at improving the physical consumption and the well-being that comes from that. And so Steve already mentioned this briefly, but economics provided the navigational tools to make it through the Great Depression. And some of these tools, I'll talk a lot today about general equilibrium modeling, but also just understanding the basics of capital accumulation, creating that economic consensus. And what did this get us? Let's not forget huge poverty reductions worldwide. The statistic that stands out to me is that the life expectancy of somebody born in the U.S. at 1900 was 41 years old. That's not too far away, and it is much less than it is now. We have improved our consumption, improved our healthcare systems, all these things that go along with that, and we are, by some pretty easy to define metrics, doing all right at that in some places. Of course, the huge caveat, some places. But the success here in increasing consumption, production, and therefore the consumption of these welfare-producing goods has also raised new challenges. And this is oversimplifying, but I think it is useful to think about the challenge as switching from one of overconsumption now as the problem instead of underconsumption, which was basically the problem of the Great Depression. But as we go towards this change, I think we're increasingly going to see, and I contend, that economics has a massive blind spot, and that is that the economy is embedded in the biosphere. Now, I think probably everybody here recognizes this, but still in the workhorse models that we use, the biosphere and the way it supports the economy is not explicitly represented, at least not in the full complexity that we know is there. And this is important because now the challenges we face are increasingly global. We have interconnected markets, and more the questions we're answering are going to be based on common resources. So Steve put up the cost-benefit and the profitable, not profitable chart. Increasingly, the ones that we have to solve, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, are in that area that are not profitable but have a huge marginal benefit to do. And so we need to figure out how can we make progress there. But put more simply, and using this term that economists always seem to love so much, I believe that to navigate the Anthropocene, what do we need? We need to create a more general equilibrium, to misuse the terms just a little bit. Okay, so the context here. Going quickly, we know that there are planetary boundaries. We've talked about that in a number of talks, and that we should not surpass the ecological ceiling, which is here defined as that outer green line. The red rays coming out are the different planetary boundaries. This is from Stefan Rockström, others, the whole planetary boundaries framework. But simultaneously, we also know that we need to be above some sort of social foundation. We need to provide sufficient access to foundational goods and services. And this was put forth in a compelling way as donut economics from Kate Raworth in 2017. Although it's making more standard forays into the academic literature very recently with Johan Rockström's safe and just corridor. The idea is this donut, or this corridor, we need to be able to figure out how to navigate through the Anthropocene while staying in that relatively narrow space. And I love this. That's a wonderful framework, but it's really limited. And where is it limited? It doesn't answer the key things that you might care about. It can tell you, are we in the donut or the safe and just corridor? But it becomes less useful when you have to answer specific questions like, what policies should we pursue? And that's really where my interest is. And so I would say that staying within this safe and just corridor requires detailed models, not just frameworks, but detailed models of how the Earth and the economy are linked. And we've done tons of work on this. I think a lot of the prior focus was really on the impacts side. How does some sort of activity in the economy impact on Earth systems like deforestation? But where a lot of the research that Steve talked about, the Natural Capital Project, and others who think about ecosystem services have focused on is where are their dependencies? Where would a change in ecosystems or Earth systems result in a real loss to people's welfare or the economy overall? And so what did we do? For the paper that I'm presenting today, we essentially tried to create that model in a very practicable, implementable way. And so we took two of the most well-known models, in this case GTAP, which I'll talk about, and INVEST, which Steve has already talked about, and glued them together. There's a lot more to that, hence a long paper. And I would say one of the downsides of writing in PNAS is, not focused on the methods. This was a methods-heavy lift. And so check out our supplemental information at 156 pages, I think, at this point. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done there. Our motivation for this paper was asking, could we make an actionable, decision-relevant model that fills out that question of how? How do we stay within the safe and just corridor? So I'll preview first, and then I'll talk about these in turn. But the basic idea is represented here. We're going to start by running our model once, GTAP-AE, I'll say what that is, but we're going to project into the future. And this gets us, among other things, a critical variable, which is an endogenously determined calculation for how much land use change would we expect. That becomes an input into a land use change model we call SEALS. And this is a necessary step because having land use change at the country or agroecological zone scale is nowhere near high enough resolution to plug into Earth systems models, like the sediment retention model that Steve showed from the Natural Capital Project. So the second step then is downscaling it. We do this globally at 300 meters, so a fairly high resolution. Once that map is created, that's then an input into our INVEST models, which I'll go quickly through. because the final step then is to take the outputs of invest, and what we're going to do is we're going to run GTAP a second time. And this will be for the same time period, so we're not going forward a step yet. It's going to be the same economy, but now with those degraded ecosystem services. And so the differences between step 1 and 4 would be the difference in GDP or welfare, at least in this case as measured by equivalent variation, with and without those ecosystem service-related shocks in the model. It gets really complicated to do all those. So this is just a preview diagram, but we're going to walk all the way around this Earth economy model here in the next few minutes. And in particular, I'm going to start by focusing on what do we have to do to make the econ part of the model work in the context that we needed. And so what we did is worked very closely with the Global Trade Analysis Project, GTAP. And this was founded a long time ago, 1992, but we had the fortunate benefit of working directly with the founder, Tom Hurdle, of that. This is a publicly funded organization with core support from some of the biggest names in international trade, development, statistical offices, et cetera. And it's a big and growing community. To want to highlight, though, it's almost confusing. There's two distinct components that GTAP is known for. The first is just the database that many of us use. And this is a standardized, harmonized, curated data set of regions, sectors, input-output relationships, trade flows, tariffs, all the things you need to know on a practical level to do this type of analysis. The second thing they're known for, though, is the GTAP Computable General Equilibrium, or CGE, model. And so I want to talk about that. This might be common knowledge to many people here in this room, but still I want to focus on it for just a second, because it's important to where the hard work really had to take place to make this all work. So computable, C. These need to be sufficiently detailed and linked to real-world data. This is not a theoretical exercise. In the model version that we run, we have 36 different sectors in 141 different countries, and so that's a lot of production functions in a lot of different locations. And with that constraint, then, it needs to be computable still in finite time. So we're also, here I'm emphasizing, we're going to solve this in numeric terms, not in solving some sort of dynamic programming approach. This is going to solve it numerically. It's general, though, in the sense that all the parts of the economy interact. We have the circular flow. I've got this chart here that is just a particular example of how the variables in GTAP flow among different parts of the economy. And it's equilibrium, where all the basic good stuff of economics, producers maximize profits, consumers maximize utility, and prices adjust until all of our markets clear. So that's a CGE. The one we use is based on the core model, as it's referred to, which models the entire economy, and GDP is endogenous here, so that's not going to be a calibration parameter. And we have exhaustive bilateral trade and transport ties. For better or worse, the origin of GTAP was as a trade analysis tool, and so we have quite a bit of detail there. We use the latest version of it, which was in Kurong et al. 2017. But before going to what we actually did, I want to mention the GTAP community has been successful because it's promoted open science, and they have a wide variety of different spin-off models, if you will. It's almost an alphabet soup of different variants of the GTAP model, like GTAP-AE for energy, or bio for biofuels, or POV for poverty. The one that we're going to use today is the GTAP-AEZ, or Agroecological Zone Model, which has in the past been used for assessing how can we optimally use our global land cover that we have. The way it works is it breaks down the world not just into countries, it does use that, but also splits the world into 18 zones. These are going to be based on just basic climatic aridity, humidity conditions, and growing period information. But what this does is it allows us to identify how land is used as an input into the production functions calibrated to each of those different agroecological zones. And this has been used a whole bunch of times. Most of the time that it's been looking at specific topics like biofuels. Is it a good idea? Or the water-food nexus. And it's been used many times in GHG mitigation, especially with respect to land-based emissions. And a side note, it's also the database and model that is underpinning a lot of our large-scale, especially land-focused integrated assessment models, such as GCAM or AIM, or the farm and EPA models that we have here in the U.S. So what's the structure here of this model? Like many of such models in this space, we're going to have a production function, and it's going to be just a constant elasticity of transformation CET function, and is going to be parameterized by a pretty basic equation. So the production Y in sector I is going to be a function of this, where the real lifting goes on in the middle. We're going to iterate over all the different J inputs to production. And being a CGE, this is going to be a lot of different sectors. And so basically that's the three different boxes underneath the output. Based on the elasticity of substitution, the producers are going to be choosing the optimal set of inputs to production, basic econ here. We add a lot of specificity, though, by nesting these equations into each other. And so instead of just saying it's a one-shot choice where, based on the elasticities, the producer chooses how much endowments of value-added inputs versus intermediate goods from other sectors, that value-added input calculation itself is going to be the result of a previous set of equations, also CET functions, where we figure out how much land is being used. The AEZ extension then says, let's not regard land as a dollar value denominated bit of capital. And let's actually even go farther than just saying it's a aerial unit, a hectare of land. Let's actually try to get at the quality of the land. What is the yield there? How in one location does that change the productivity in the production function of this one sector, say agriculture or pasture, differently when you use land in one location versus another. So the point is, we're trying to add a lot of the realism, and this is important because things like agriculture, and also, as I'll get to, ecosystem services, are hugely spatially heterogeneous, and that's been a theme that's come up throughout. So this structure is there so that we can say specific things that still rely on basic econ theory, but give us enough flexibility to parameterize it to match that complexity, that spatial heterogeneity. One of the biggest things we had to do to modify the AEZ model was change how it regarded the stock of land. The standard GTAP-AEZ model, as well as basically every other model out there with one exception, regards the amount of land, the amount of as capital essentially, that is available for production in the economy as fixed. And this is not a great assumption if what you're caring about is things like agricultural expansion into natural land. And so if you're competing over just a fixed stock of land that can't grow or shrink, you can't really say much about agricultural expansion. And so what we did is we created a new version of GTAP-AEZ in which the land supply functions are, where we added land supply functions. So rather than just having a fixed amount of land, a stock of land that can be used in production, what if we actually put out a supply function for it? And so, in other words, when we're thinking about the producer's problem, maximizing profit subject to the usage of its inputs, instead of taking one of those inputs, x sub I, which would represent land as fixed, we're going to plug in an equation there. And this equation we're going to calculate from spatially explicit GIS data. And so in other words, instead of being something that is fixed and set by the FAO or whomever, we're going to say it's going to be some upward sloping curve looking a little bit like this. And so each AEZ is parameterized with a differently shaped curve representing what stock and quality of land is available in that AEZ for each of the different types of production towards which it might be used. And so, because we do everything at a high resolution, we have a lot of information to leverage here. This isn't going to be looking at a per country arable land statistic. We actually go in and, based on crop suitability models, crop models themselves, and many other spatial variables, we try to get the exact shape of this curve right. But I'll list this as a frontier where I think a lot more research could be done. But the basic idea here, and why this is so important, is that now, not only is the amount of land used in economic production no longer fixed, it's part of the optimization. So if you're a landowner and you realize that you could produce more profitably, but you need more land, well, you can bid up the price of land. The sort of basics of economics here now do apply. And that surprisingly simple conclusion, or the feature of a model, has really been absent in much of the application at a global scale for analyzing conservation policy. And so why might that matter? a policy like land protection at a large scale, like for instance, 30% of the earth by 2030, 30 plans out there. These are going to be ones that take a lot of land out of production, and we don't want to say that that is going to have no effect on the economy. This framework allows us to model that. Here you can see just an example. We're going to shift the asymptote in, and this will result in a new land supply curve that is shifted, just like in our basic economic 101, which means that we'll have less use of land, but now at a higher price. The critical methodological point here is that this means that removing land from production is no longer free, which has been assumed in a lot of global conservation assessments. Okay, that's been the basis for the model that went into the article I talked about, but immediately upon setting down that path, wherein we created a comparative static model, we knew we needed to have a recursive dynamic model, but we just broke it off into chunks. So now I want to talk about the next step of the model. The World Bank, and in particular the Changing Wealth of Nations team that puts out their great reports on inclusive wealth at a regular interval, engaged with us to say, how could we say something about the future of inclusive wealth? And they recognized that to be able to say something that was specific to different policies that might be implemented, you need to have a model that essentially is like the CGE that we created. And so they want to calculate policy contingent estimates of inclusive wealth, and essentially they've given us a block of time to create a new model, which we're cleverly naming GTAP-Invest RD for Recursive-Dynamic. But it's going to be leveraging what I described before and doing a sequence of time-based comparative static optimizations, but with myopic expectations. And so that's a big departure from, I think, a lot of the modeling approaches used in this banking type of community. But what that buys us is the ability to have much more detailed economy in terms of the number of sectors and the number of different regions. And basically, then we just take the outputs of one comparative static equilibrium calculation and plug it into the next year, but of course keeping track of how endowments change, technology and preferences, policy, etc. The only thing that we've added that is actually a little bit more towards a standard dynamic model is we do have the endogenous capital accumulation effect that is driving capital accumulation, so basic equation of motion, keeping track of how does investment, as is determined by the CGE, get used for creation of capital in the next period. So that was the main step I wanted to talk about. What did we have to do to get the econ model working? I want to quickly, very quickly, talk about 3 of the remaining steps to fully link this system all together. I think the main reason why this type of work hadn't been done before, at a global scale at least, is because the second step here. It's really hard to go from coarse projections of land use change down to something like 300 meters, which is what's needed for all sorts of different Earth systems models. So we used a downscaling algorithm that we call SEALS, and we've now had a couple of publications on it. I won't go into the details, but the basic idea is we need to go from that map above here in panels A and B, which is the endogenously determined number of hectares of, in this case, agricultural expansion that is calculated to happen in each of these country AEZs, and go towards something like this in a sensible way. How do we go and do that step? We rely on a land use change algorithm that is able to do a couple of things, not just say where does the new crop expansion happen, but we also had this extra criterion that we needed to have it be able to implement grid cell specific different interventions, like for instance putting riparian vegetation along the edges of streams to hold that sediment in right before it makes it into the stream. We wanted to be able to do our land use change model and have that level of complexity. I'll skip the details of this, but basically we trained a spatial adjacency machine learning algorithm with some cross-validation approaches to come up with an algorithm that takes as an input the amount of land use change at the AEZ level and outputs our land use change maps. The third step then is what Steve has already started talking about, is taking the land use change map and using it as one of the primary inputs to our different ecosystem service models. And so currently, the GTAP-Invest framework calculates 6 global ecosystem services, which are sediment retention, climate regulation, pollination of crops, timber production, coastal protection, and marine fisheries. And Steve already presented this, but I just want to put a shout out again to a lot of this has been made possible by the open source software provided by the Natural Capital project. And that is what enables calculations like this to be able to be computed, not just at all, but at very, very large spatial scales. And so the emphasis that I would say here is this sort of calculation, that's for 1 pixel of interest. You need to think about the hydrological routing conditions of how does water in that upslope transport area flow downhill through a pixel of interest and then continue to flow through gullies and other transport across the land all the way to a stream. But you need to do that for each pixel in your area of interest. And so that means using 30-meter resolution digital elevation model results for the whole globe. And so we're talking in the tens of billions of pixels here. And so that's been computationally challenging, I guess. And it's only been very recently that we've been even able to do this. NatCap started off as a very project-by-project, small watershed-based analysis. But now in 2019 in Science, we put out a paper that was sort of our coming out paper of, hey, look, we can do this globally now. And we've had a variety of papers since that have expanded the set of ecosystem services that we can compute at this scale. And so just for pretty map's sake, carbon storage, marine fisheries. Coastal protection was a little different because we're breaking the world down into segments of the coastline instead of grid cells, water yield, and wild pollination. You might look at these maps and say, I don't see anything. It's such a high-resolution map, and so we always have to zoom in to see anything of interest. And so here on the left, we have the land use land cover map, which is that primary input from the previous step, and it looks roughly the same, the top and the bottom on the left-hand panel, but when you zoom in, you can see where the provision of pollination services actually happens is actually pretty different, and this just highlights the need to have this high degree of spatial resolution because you'd miss a lot of this at coarser resolutions. The final step in this modeling approach, once you've got your changes in ecosystem services, how do you go to the economic valuation? Traditionally, this has been done by all sorts of contingent valuation, revealed preferences, hedonics. There's a whole very large literature in this area, but we're kind of going to go in a different way. Instead of taking a dollar value or a monetary measure of each unit of provision of ecosystem services, we're going to instead express it as a shock to the macroeconomic model. And so no longer are we saying this is the dollar value of each unit of pollination. This is basically taking what Steve said about using the imputed value, but having a very detailed model, in this case a CGE, to calculate how could we impute that model. So the thing that we actually get from the ecosystem service model is something, all we need is something that is a change in the yield parameter that goes into that production function for the different pollinator-dependent crops. And so I'll go quick for this because we're getting short on time, but there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity here. We calculate where does the sufficiency of pollination fall below a critical threshold, where the scientific literature starts to show there are indeed yield effects. And then ultimately we get this as a gridded estimate of yield changes, which we then need to upscale to be to represent the total, or the average in this case, change within that particular AEZ, for that particular crop that we're looking at, calculate what is the shock to the production function from this change in pollination. Once we scale that up, then the rest of it becomes much more straightforward CGE economic analysis. We express it as a shock and solve for equilibrium again that second time. And comparing that equilibrium to the first one without the ecosystem service degradation gets us at an imputed value of the ecosystem service itself. Because I've been going so slow, I want to jump straight to results and say a few of our key findings. Number one, nature matters. But more than mattering, it matters especially for low-income countries. And so what we found is that when we run our model and calculate GDP or equivalent variation, we see significant reductions in that GDP when we do account for ecosystem services compared to when we take the false belief that no ecosystem services matter to the economy. What we also found, though, is that impacts were much greater among low-income countries. And this, in a certain sense, isn't too surprising. We've seen in the literature lots of cases where lower-income countries tend to rely more on both nature but also common goods. And so the modeling that says, well, how does that value into GDP? Well, it's not too surprising. That would say it does matter more in those locations. Although I will just take the moment to say that's a welcome finding, because much of the history of global conservation policy has very much been at odds with local populations. It has not gone over well with people saying, you can't do any agricultural on your land. That would be considered quite the strong statement. And a lot of the proposed environmental policies thereby have had negative impacts on low-income countries. Here, when expressing it in terms of ecosystem services, we sort of have the fortunate finding it the other way around. These policies that are good tend to be best for low-income countries. Side note, and this comes back to what's the underestimate of the infinite value of nature. These are extremely, extremely conservative estimates, and why? Is because, number one, we're only capturing the ecosystem services that we can actually compute globally, and there's tons that we can't, and probably the more valuable ones tend to be the ones that we can't compute. But moreover, we're only considering those ecosystem services for which we can make a linkage between the change in ecosystem service provision and the endogenously calculated effect in the economy. Besides just finding that nature matters, though, we also tried to establish what might policies do and who would they be best for. And so we analyzed 4 policies. The first was repurposing agricultural subsidies as revenue-neutral transfers, or investments in ag R&D, so I was glad to have our plenary talk on that, or 2 different forms of payments for ecosystem services, where in the first one, the global community is responsible for funding it, and in the second one, the nation itself is responsible for funding it. And not surprisingly, we find the combination of these policies was the best, but this also hits on that really important point, I think, is that where to go? Oops, I missed that point entirely. Is that these policies that we implemented all had the greatest benefit in those low-income countries. So these 2 complementary results are here, is that the nature is especially valuable to those low-income countries, and thereby, if you have policies that are built based on that recognition, you can find policies that will have the greatest benefit in those same countries. So some concluding thoughts and comments. I use this phrase, Earth economy modeling. And why did I use that phrase? Well, I think we're at a threshold in the integrated ecosystem economy modeling space. We've seen increasing computational power with greatly improved data sets from things like satellites, remote sensing. I would also credit the increasing emphasis on open source science. That has been critical to enable the level of cooperation that we need. And I think this leads to a new type of modeling. Within our particular research lab at the University of Minnesota, we've been referring to this as Earth economy modeling to represent the fact that we are trying to close that loop, to not just have the economy maybe loosely connected to the biosphere, but deeply intertwined. And so what is Earth economy modeling, at least in the way that we talk about it? It really is bringing back the general to general equilibrium and making it more general. And so it's a global model that combines what you'd expect, a global economy-wide model, but with global ecosystem-wide models. These are aspirational, of course, we leave out lots of important things, but that's the aim. An important part, though, is that we're going to represent the world, the state variable, if you will, as a very high-resolution depiction of the Earth. And so that's where, methodologically, it differs much from other approaches that have previously linked the economy and the biosphere. But we have to do this all while being detailed enough for specific policy analysis. And so that's the aspirational goal. There's a ton of models out here. The colors are washed out on the screen. But you can see basically this is a trade-off between building models with more economic complexity on the vertical axis versus spatial resolution or biophysical detail on the vertical axis. And there's all sorts of different entrants into this space. And so we've reviewed quite a few of those. But I would contend it's possible to push the frontier, again the frontier, to the upper right and leverage advances increases in open source software and computing power to create models that have increases in both. And so, to end with, who are the new partners to push this frontier, to make those models? Well, central banks, first off. Here we are. That's great. Other ones is the financial sector and investors. We're just about to publish an asset management perspective piece with the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which says, how does changes in Earth economy results affect our investment decisions? Others, we have a new grant at the University of Minnesota called AI Climate, which is an NF-supported center to basically say, how could we use AI to push that modeling frontier through things like model emulation or better machine learning algorithms. I also want to give a shout out here to GlassNet. This is another NSF grant that funded the global to local analysis of systems sustainability. This is kind of a new discipline, and it intensely involves crossing spatial scales in a systematic and replicable way. But the last one I'll end with, this one also has a question mark, which I should have deleted, but I'm glad I didn't, is NatCap Teams. Teams is the Earth Economy Modelers. And so this is very preliminary, but we're thinking of launching a new consortium. There's a lot of demand, and we are having a hard time keeping up with the demand for this type of modeling. And so what if we organized ourselves into something that was dedicated to mainstreaming the use of this type of Earth economy model for all these different types of partners interested in doing it? So with that, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me.